To say I was excited when Chocobo GP was announced for the Nintendo Switch last month would be an understatement. And yet, even amidst my exultation, I couldn't help but notice that some people weren't even aware that this wasn't Square's first attempt at a kart racing game with Final Fantasy characters, but rather a follow-up to a 22-year-old game called Chocobo Racing. Now, this wasn't entirely surprising because, unfortunately, the original probably did go a bit under the radar, but nevertheless, it is a bit of a shame that so many Final Fantasy fans seem to know so little about this unique entry in this series, which is precisely why I'm making this video, to shine attention on a game that so richly deserves more than it gets, and to clarify what Chocobo Racing is and isn't, and why it's still worth checking out even today. So let's get right into what the game is not. A Mario Kart clone, or knockoff, or ripoff, or however you want to phrase that label. I'd like to address this before anything else because it does seem to be a relatively common preconceived notion. Kart racing games just can't seem to escape comparison to the juggernaut in the genre that is Mario Kart, and in the worst of cases they are outright dismissed with the aforementioned labels. Now, don't get me wrong, there may be cases where the denomination of Mario Kart clone might apply, but I assure you, it couldn't be further from the truth when it comes to Chocobo Racing. Now, if you haven't played it, I can understand making that assumption, but those of us who have know that it absolutely carved out its own unique identity, and is actually one of the most original and creative kart racing games out there, made by a company that was firing on all cylinders at the time. That's right, Chocobo Racing came out smack dab in the middle of Square's golden era of the PlayStation 1, being released in March of 1999, just 1 month after Final Fantasy VIII. Seriously, everything Square touched in those days turned to gold. The quality and quantity of their output was just insane. I mean, look at all the RPGs they released for the PS1 that went on to become bona fide classics of the genre. Final Fantasy VII, 8, 9, Tactics, Vagrant Story, Chrono Cross, Xenogears, all in the span of just 3.5 years. It's just mad. God, I miss those days. But anyway, Chocobo Racing is obviously not an RPG, but it does fit right in with those in a different way. It's a game full of soul and personality, made by passionate creators who genuinely cared about the quality of their craft and loved to experiment and innovate. Now, by this point, you may be thinking I'm taking the praise too far and beginning to ask what makes this game so special and unique, and what exactly makes it stand apart from Mario Kart after all? Well, many things. For starters, in a very unconventional move for a kart racer, the game has a story mode. Yes, it's got a proper story with actual dialogue scenes and plot progression, and it was written by none other than Takashi Tokita, who had previously worked as a scenario writer on both Final Fantasy IV and Chrono Trigger. Tokita was also the lead game designer for Final Fantasy IV, while in Chrono Trigger he fulfilled the roles of both writer and director. After that, he was also involved in the development of Final Fantasy VII as an event planner, before once again taking on both writing and directorial duties in Chocobo Racing, where he was, of course, joined by his old pal and the father of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi, who oversaw the project as its executive producer. Now, the concept of incorporating a story into a kart racing game is a rather novel one, but with a talent like Takashi Tokita at the creative helm, it worked out to perfection.
So, yes, we can.
And the end result is honestly something every Final Fantasy fan should experience, for it is an incredibly endearing and heartfelt tribute to the franchise. But we'll get back to the story later. For now, let's do good on my promise to clarify how Chocobo Racing is far from a Mario Kart clone by examining its distinct, creative, and innovative gameplay. There's 3 areas in which Chocobo Racing's gameplay stands out: the drifting system, the ability system, and the item system. Let's start with drifting. Chocobo Racing is different in the sense that there isn't a dedicated drift button per se. Rather, you slide or skid by holding the brake button while accelerating and then turning in either direction to drift towards your left or your right. But you can't skid for too long or your vehicle will spin out. It's a tricky mechanic that requires some practice and precision, and that might scare a few players away. But once you get the hang of it, navigating the track's twists and turns becomes a fun and stimulating challenge. And it's quite satisfying when you finally manage to smoothly traverse a track that initially caused you to hit the walls or fall off all the time. Next up is the ability system. Unlike drifting and items, this is something that simply doesn't exist in Mario Kart and many other games of the genre. In Chocobo Racing, the characters can actually equip unique abilities to use throughout the race, meaning players have another tool in their arsenal besides the items they pick up to harm their opponents or enhance themselves, which of course adds a whole other layer of complexity and strategy to the racing. These abilities are wide and varied, ranging from a simple dash with increased speed to a magic barrier that protects you from enemy spells, and can be used periodically throughout a race as the ability gauge fills up over time. The amount of time it takes for the gauge to fill up varies per ability. Weaker abilities, like Mog's Flap, are very quick to fill up, so you can use them many times throughout a race, while stronger abilities, like Bahamut's Mega Flare or Squall's Gunblade, can take a long time to charge, meaning you won't be able to activate them very often, and so you gotta make each use count. Now, each ability technically belongs to a specific character, and the CPU will always have that character's default ability equipped, but the game actually lets you pick any ability with any character, probably for the sake of making every racer viable and competitive, as some abilities are clearly better and more useful than others. Okay, so we already have a system which Mario Kart wholly lacks, but how does Chocobo Racing's item system compare to Mario Kart's? Well, to be blunt, it blows it out of the water. No, seriously, don't get me wrong, I love Mario Kart and I play it all the time, but the item system in Chocobo Racing is simply far more intricate and strategic. How, you ask? Well, for starters, when you reach a row of items, some will be hidden behind a question mark, just like in Mario Kart, but others will be perfectly visible and identifiable, meaning you can actually try to grab the ones you want. Now, you might think the items being visible makes things a little too easy, but that is actually not the case, because in Chocobo Racing you need to evolve your items in order for them to become truly strong and devastating. See, as part of a sub-series within the Final Fantasy series, Chocobo Racing makes great use of the rich Final Fantasy lore by making the items magicite. In other words, magic stones containing classic spells like Fire, Blizzard, Thunder, Haste, Reflect, Minimize, Doom, or Ultima. And except for Reflect and Doom, all of these spells can be upgraded into stronger versions of themselves with each copy you pick up. So, say you're holding one Fire and pick up another one, it becomes Fyra. Pick up a third one and it becomes Fyraga, and the power of the item grows accordingly. Fire shoots a fireball forward, but you have to aim it, and it's tricky to land it on a moving opponent. Fyra, however, automatically homes in on the cart in front of you, so you don't have to worry about aiming. And then you have Fyraga, which does the same, but when it hits the racer in front of you, instead of disappearing, it continues and hits every single cart that may be ahead of you. And similarly, the other spells evolve in their own unique and interesting ways. So whenever you pick up an item, you have to make a choice, whether to use it right away, or wait and see if you can grab another copy and upgrade it for maximum effect. Of course, if you wait too long, you might miss your chance to use it at the opportune moment, which introduces a neat risk versus reward dynamic. This key dynamic is exponentially amplified by yet another layer of this veritable wedding cake of an item system, which is the mechanic of item stealing. See, in Chocobo Racing, when you pick up an item, you actually carry it behind your cart, which gives your opponents the opportunity to steal it by bumping into it. So, for example, you may be holding on to a Thundara in hopes of picking up a third Thunder and thus evolving your Magicite to the devastating Fandaga, but just before you manage to accomplish that, an opponent comes from behind and steals your precious Thundara, possibly hitting you with it instead. And likewise, you can do the same to them and incorporate that into your strategy. Now that is risk versus reward at its best, and it absolutely ensures that you stay on your toes for the entirety of the race. So, as you can see, don't be fooled by how cute this game looks. It is both complex and challenging, and the races can get quite tense and thrilling. Alright, now let's move on to the parts that will make Final Fantasy fans rejoice the most, starting with the overall presentation and content. Right from the start, from the very opening of the game and the menus that follow, you can see this was a game where care went into, that it was made by people who wanted to create something special and cared about putting out a game that would bring smiles to the faces of Final Fantasy fans. I mean, just look at the main menu. Look at the way Chocobo turns his head and follows whichever option you highlight with his eyes. It's just freaking adorable, man. And the entire game is full of neat little touches like this. From the free count at the beginning of a race being signaled by free bombs, to the classic victory fanfare that plays when you win. As well as all the other songs provided by Nobuo Uematsu and arranged by Kenji Ito, and all the myriad wonderful references to the series that the game packs in every little corner. And trust me, there's lots of corners to explore, because this game isn't lacking in content either. The story mode may be short, but it is incredibly sweet and fun to replay, and each time you complete it, you unlock something new, be it a new track or secret racers, like Cloud and Squall. You can also compete against a friend or the CPU in both Versus and Grand Prix mode, and in the latter, each character even gets their own adorable ending FMV, almost like the individual character endings in the arcade mode of a classic fighting game. There's also the mandatory time attack mode, of course, as well as a relay race mode, where you play as a team of 3 racers with each covering a lap, calling back to the party system of the Final Fantasy series. All of these things and neat little details reveal the surprising amount of care and genuine passion that went into this seemingly minor side game, making it feel like a true labor of love, as well as a beautiful love letter to the Final Fantasy franchise. And nowhere is that more apparent than in Chocobo Racing's story. So, how did Takashi Tokita incorporate a story into a kart racer? Well, with an appropriately high degree of fourth wall breaking humor and levity, but no less heart as a result. The story of Chocobo Racing is equal parts hilarious and endearing, light-hearted and touching, and it's presented as a fabulously cute picture book, complete with chapter titles and page turning. Really charming and artistically inspired stuff. And then there's the exceedingly lovable cast, which is made up of classic Final Fantasy creatures, monsters, summons, and even job classes, who truly come to life in this tale as their own full-fledged characters and share some really fun interactions and great banter. The whole thing feels almost like a pastiche of Final Fantasy, a playful yet sincere homage, full of references to nostalgic names like Mysidia or Minwu, and iconic elements such as airships and of course, crystals. The basic premise is hilariously absurd in all the right ways. The titular Chocobo and his Moogle sidekick, nicknamed Mog in the English version, receive vehicles from, who else, the ingenious inventor Sid. But while Chocobo is happy with his sweet rollerblades, Mog is not amused by his shabby scooter, feeling he once again got the short end of the stick, which only aggravates his sense of indignation that the Chocobo hogs all the spotlight and gets preferential treatment as the series mascot. And so, fueled by his deep-seated jealousy, he vows to change that status quo, which naturally includes changing the name of the game itself to Moogle Racing. In order to accomplish this, Mog departs on an adventure with Chocobo, who is perfectly oblivious to his companion's comical malice and accompanies him simply for the joy and fun of adventuring itself. Chocobo is great. He almost works like a classic silent protagonist, like the heroes of the original Final Fantasy, and is honestly one of the best of his kind. His personality absolutely shines through his mannerisms and attitude, his choices and inclinations, and of course, through all the different variations of his delightful. He's curious, courageous, and perky, a genuine, happy-go-lucky free spirit, and the perfect protagonist for this peculiarly endearing tale. Mog, on the other hand, is sly and devious in positively hilarious ways, while Sid serves the role of a quite amusing and charming active narrator. The story also works as a great introduction to the gameplay, as it's structured in such a way that each chapter introduces a new ability and item, and explains how they function. Plus, in each chapter, you reach a new location with a new track, where you meet a new character, and recruit them to your ever-growing party. These characters are all iconic and symbolic of the series, but also unique and endearing in their own personal ways. Golem, for example, is a big dude who may seem scary at first, but is actually an honest, wholesome guy, Goblin, on the other hand, is a bandit with a bad reputation, but there's more to him than meets the eye. The Black Mage is uncanny and mysterious, while the White Mage is kind and considerate, but can also be rather bold and incisive when reproaching those who misbehave, which is amusingly reminiscent of another White Mage girl written by Takashi Tokita. And there's more colorful characters still, like Chubby Chocobo, a gluttonous slob, or Behemoth, a fearsome guardian, as well as a macho dude who likes to flex his muscles. The wacky adventures, fun interactions, and humorous banter that this unlikely band of heroes share, as well as the camaraderie that develops between them, are a sight to behold. And if Final Fantasy means anything to you, then I assure you, the conclusion to this picturesque tale and the absolutely gorgeous credit sequence and song that follow it will surely melt your heart, even if it has become cynical or jaded towards the series over time. Of course, despite everything I've said, you may not feel this way about Chocobo Racing. It's by no means a perfect game, and like most games, has its share of flaws. For example, there's only 10 racing tracks in total. The split-screen multiplayer suffers from significant frame rate drops, and the racers and abilities are a little too unbalanced. And of course, it bears repeating that it is a 22-year-old game, and it kinda looks like one, so if you're not that into retro gaming, it may not strike a chord with you. But I still think it deserves a chance, and certainly more attention and love than it currently gets. So hopefully, I've managed to pique your curiosity, at least a little. Hell, even just watching the game's story on YouTube could prove to be a fun and rewarding experience if you consider yourself a big Final Fantasy fan. And hey, for those who just can't be bothered to pick up and play an old game, especially one as regrettably difficult to get your hands on as Chocobo Racing, there's always Chocobo GP next year if you got a Switch. Of course, I can't speak for how that one will turn out. Takashi Tokita, the driving force behind the original, doesn't seem to be involved with it in any way.
See you.
But, nevertheless, I'm still excited and cautiously optimistic about it. But regardless of how Chocobo GP turns out, all in all, Chocobo Racing remains a classic title that should still prove to be an enjoyable ride for kart racing game fans. And what's more, a magical and heartwarming trip for all Final Fantasy lovers out there. Well, that's my Chocobo Racing review, I suppose. Hope you've enjoyed it, and if so, please help this Vagrant Chocobo out by liking the video, and perhaps sharing it with others that might be curious about the upcoming Chocobo GP, but aren't aware of its charming predecessor. And if you'd like to see more Final Fantasy related content like this, then consider subscribing to the channel since there's plenty more of that to come. Alright, that's all for now. See you again, Chocobros.